Hey everybody, thank you for coming out tonight. This is the Penn State Technology Club, and tonight we have James Reichle talking about, his talk is about a glance at malware OSINT, and you can take it away.
All right, perfect. Let me make sure I get the screen share set up real quick. And we should be good to go, I presume.
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. All right. So as Ray mentioned, I am James Tyler Reichle, and I'm going to be doing a talk at the intersection of malware analysis and open source intelligence. So who am I? Obviously, we covered that I'm James Tyler Reichle, also known as the Presumptuous Commoner, PresComm. If you I might reference my blog a couple of points in the future, so that might be important. I'm currently a security operations manager focusing in risk assessment and risk management at a managed service provider in the New York metro area. Kind of a brief trajectory of my career. I worked my way up from a slot technician at a casino to working as the junior assistant administrator at that casino. Met my, at the time, girlfriend, currently wife, and moved all the way from Kansas to New York, where I took a job as a printer technician that I hated. I did help desk kind of on my own, hated that, but I did learn some valuable lessons from both. Finally landed my current company, worked my way from security engineer to where I am. And I mention that because you would be surprised how much random knowledge like that comes in handy, which I'm kind of going to touch on a little bit later. I currently work mostly on gathering information to support risk assessment and risk management, which is everything from designing questionnaires, guiding people through questionnaires, because not everyone has the same level of comfortability with answering technical questions, doing physical inspections or having people do physical inspections of their environment, technical analysis, and occasionally some open source intelligence just to kind of gauge people's footprint, see how susceptible they might be to certain attacks, or at least what they look like to the outside world when it comes to reputation. I previously was heavily involved in incident response for basically designing our processes out at my current job. Currently, I only really get involved if it's something fairly serious or if it's something that needs to feed into the risk assessment process. But a lot of the lessons I've learned that I'm going to use in this talk have come from some of that past experience. So currently, I wrote this and I said in my spare time, I continue to pursue certifications. I'm not going to say I enjoy pursuing them. I enjoy getting them. I don't necessarily enjoy pursuing them in the process. I more enjoy doing things like HackTheBox, Geoguessr, Sourcing.Games, Quiztime, things like that that actually kind of test knowledge and kind of have some practical application. I try to participate in as many Trace Lab events, and I know I'm throwing a lot of names out there that maybe people may or may not be familiar with, but any one of those things, if you look them up, will be fairly easy to recognize. Mostly they all involve either open source intelligence or offensive security. And more recently, I joined up with Searchlight to start doing some open source related intelligence work, including writing articles and just kind of working as a community. Kind of going to go over what we can expect from this talk, but this is also the part where I throw out a disclaimer that I have 3 wonderful dog children that I love very much, but that also like to bark at the most inconvenient of times. If someone drives by or if a leaf breezes by on the wind. So I will try to mute myself if that happens, but I can't guarantee that I will beat them to the punch. So if it does happen, bear with me. I will try the best I can to avoid that happening though. So as far as the nature of this talk, it's quick, high-level stuff. I'm not diving into anything really advanced. The goal of this is kind of just demonstrate and develop a framework for things that you can take away and maybe build on. A lot of these concepts, especially in open source intelligence, if I recommend one site that works with DNS records, for example, there are 24 different sites that could replace it, or that might do things slightly differently. So just keep that in mind. This is really just kind of give you an idea of what's possible. It is not a textbook or the absolute certain way that you have to do things. I'm not diving into anything really deep. This is not digital forensics incident response. I'm not going to be looking at really low level stuff. I'm not going to be dropping any samples out of memory, no really intense static analysis. I may make reference to those things, but I'm not trying to teach certain concepts because each of those things could themselves be individual talks. This is really just kind of glance over, hey, here's some malicious indicators. Here's some ways that you can use open source intelligence to kind of pivot from them and develop further intelligence. Before we start, I did want to mention these are malicious items, so you obviously want to take the proper precautions. You know, we're talking about things that may be phishing emails, that may have malicious links, malicious attachments. There may be websites that have malicious information on them. They may be scraping information from you. They may be hosting files that are malicious, drive-by downloads. So you obviously want to make sure you're safe while you're doing this kind of work. I had originally designed this talk with like a whole build out on how to do labs, and I realized that was probably a little too much for it. So I'm just going to say you definitely want to make sure you have some sort of environment in place before you do anything. Even if it seems like it may be simple, you're better safe than sorry when it comes to this kind of stuff. So like for me, I have a whole physical separate lab environment in my office. Some people, it may just come down to renting a virtual machine from Google or Amazon. You may need a VPN, you may need dedicated accounts for things, but obviously before you do anything, the important thing is to just kind of make sure you're safe and you're not doing anything to harm yourself or give yourself away when you're working with this stuff. I did want to touch on the difference between dynamic analysis and static analysis in malware. Really, without getting into too advanced of a discussion on it, dynamic analysis is basically letting a malicious thing do its thing, letting it run, clicking on things, letting it run in memory, execute. And static analysis is basically not letting it run and just examining the file in place, either looking at the source code, looking at the strings in the file, looking at the attributes of the file itself. You're basically not letting it run. And there is some overlap between the two, and we may briefly touch on that. But I kind of want to just give a brief, like, here's the difference between the two, and they both have different ways of handling things. I'm not going to go into a whole discussion on how to do open source intelligence, but one of the basic premises of anything that involves intelligence work is basically you start with, what do you know? So in this case, you have an email, you have a file, maybe you have some information about that file or that email, and then you have what you want to learn about that file. What's the outcome? Who sent this? What does it do? Who else may have received this? Where does this contact? You have your things you want to discover, and then the goal is basically to fill in the gap between what you know and what you want to know. You do that by asking the big questions that any journalist or intelligence analyst will do, which are who, what, when, where, why, and how. Anytime you don't have an idea where you may want to go next, you can pause, think to yourself, go through those questions, see if maybe that gives you an insight as to where you want to go next. And as I will touch on as I go through this talk, and as I try to make sure I don't go too crazy over time, it is very easy to get down into rabbit holes or to get off onto random goose chases that don't lead anywhere, especially when you have samples that have a massive amount of information behind them. So it's very important when you're doing this type of work to prioritize what you're looking for. You want to take time to diverge and converge, which basically just means coming up with a bunch of theories, diverging, and then kind of winnowing those down into a smaller set that look like they're more likely candidates, which is converging. And then also, as you're building out things, maybe take the time every once in a while when you think you've gotten something to approach it from a competing angle and maybe make sure that you're not being biased and kind of just finding things that you want to find that support your ideas. So I got the idea from the talk from this particular text message here. I got this text message about a month and a half ago. It was basically just a message saying, hey, person, you're eligible to save $417 because you don't have any DUIs. So you can click here and claim that money. And that sounds great, obviously, but this is a not great thing. If you click that link, it leads to some pretty scammy stuff. So I wanted to bring this up as an example of not only what inspired me, but also, like, this is just a text message. There's nothing advanced. It's not ransomware. It's not a virus. There's nothing really fancy about this, but even still, I wanted to point out just how much intelligence is basically embedded in just this one thing here. So I kind of took the time to highlight this and just go over it real quick. Anything that's boxed in red. So if you take a look at the top, the phone number it came from, that's a bit of intelligence, right? We can do some lookups and find out if that message has been used, find out who it belongs to, if it's been used in any other campaigns. The date and the time, which may not seem necessarily important, but threat actors surprisingly do keep regular hours. They, depending upon who is presenting the the attack, they may be keeping to their 9 to 5 hours. So if you're getting random text messages at 3 in the morning your time, it may be 3 in the afternoon their time, which is business hours for them. The whole text itself, you're eligible for $417. There's a lot that you can get out of that, right? You've got use of punctuation or lack thereof, proper grammar, proper capitalization, spelling, all that's important. If it seems like it's been put through a translation app as opposed to being written by a native English speaker, that can give some stuff away. I blanked out the name here because even though I got this on one of my phones, it's not my name. So I had to blank that out for privacy reasons, but it had a person's name that is associated with this phone number, which tells me that whoever got this to send me this malicious item had a source that had those two things tied together. It wasn't generic. It actually had a name embedded in it that was accurate. And if we go to the bottom, we have the URL, which itself has two things inside of it. So we've got, refund5.com. We've got this basic thing at the bottom here, which is this HE30DHRXDM. Basically, it's just a directory. But if that's unique, but something that's been used in other campaigns, maybe we can look stuff up on that. And obviously we can look stuff up on the domain. So just from this one text message, there's quite a bit in here that we can get out of it, which I think a lot of people may not appreciate at a first glance. The number one thing I can tell you about doing open source intelligence is Google. It don't matter what it is, if it's an IP address, if it's a domain name, if it's a file name, if it's a certificate thumbprint, whatever it is, just Google it, it's going to take you a couple of seconds, and considering the amount of stuff that might be indexed out there, it's either going to tell you something you didn't already know, or it's going to basically shorten your path because someone else has already done a little bit of research, so you don't have to rehash what they've already done. So kind of reiterate that: Google, Google, Google. It is the most important thing I can tell you. Also, there's other search engines out there. So Yahoo being, don't forget about them. I know people want to pick on them, but they index things differently. And surprisingly, there may be things in there that are not in Google that may be a little hidden secret unlocking your investigation. So basically the way that I set up this talk is I'm going to do an analysis of a bunch of different components of malicious activity. Not any particular sample, I'm just picking different fields that you could look at. So starting off with email headers, and we'll go through like certificates, IP addresses, etc., and kind of briefly touch on them. So email headers can reveal a variety of useful and important information about an email. They vary greatly between different email providers and relays. So the headers you're going to see coming out of a Yahoo relay are going to be different than the headers you see coming out of an Office 365 relay, for example. However, they can be edited or crafted directly by people. So beware of false flags, and also keep in mind that that can also be a benefit. If someone's directly manipulating things, anytime a human being gets involved, there's the chance that idiosyncrasies get involved, and that can kind of work as a thumbprint for trying to track a particular threat actor. So I just picked a random email out of a mailbox I control that happens to be designed specifically for catching all sorts of nonsense. So this is pretty basic. I'm not going to go into what's here. It's just an attachment saying, hey, you want some grant money for school? It's not legit. But aside from looking at the email itself, we can look in the headers. And in this particular case, this is in a Outlook.com, the free version of Microsoft's email solution. So if I popped open the message source, which is the headers, there's all sorts of stuff in here that we can look at. So I kind of highlighted a couple of things here that I wanted to touch on. I'm not going to go over the entirety of the email headers because there's a ton of it, and it gets worse and worse by the year, the amount of headers that get attached to emails. We've got some basic information about the email: where it came from, where it was going to, the specific host that sent it, the specific time it was sent at, the specific time it was received, things like that. We get a little bit further down in, we see the authentication results, which tells us a couple of things. So we see SPF equals fail. SPF is the basically mechanism for saying, hey, my name is Presumptuous Commoner. The only people allowed to send emails as me are these IP addresses and hosts. If anyone else sends an email as me with my from as the domain, they're lying. Don't trust them. So in this case, it failed. But you can see that the sending IP is 66.96.246.62. So that is the IP address that sent it. And we'll talk a little bit later about how to pivot onto IP addresses. But there's more in here, right? So SMTP mail from earthlink.net makes sense. DKIM, It's not signed with cryptography via DKIM. And if you go a little bit further down, you can see the receiving email IP address, which is 10.13.155.199. So you get a little bit there. Obviously, I think the most rich thing here is going to be the from address, because that's going to tell you specifically who sent it, especially if they're spoofing. That can give you a lot of information. A little bit further, you've got the actual envelope information here. So, to the IP, the email address that I control. You've got a couple of things a little bit further on. So from ccarter@earthlink.net. Now, an important thing to note here is sometimes that information doesn't jive with what's actual. So it may say from one address, but then when you look at the return path, it may be something else. So you think you're replying to the person that sent it, but you're actually replying to an entirely different address. That can be a piece of information you may want to pivot from, especially if someone's doing spoofing or something like business email compromise. In this particular case, they matched. It actually did come from that mailbox, but there's some cases where that's not going to be the case. I highlighted these not specifically to go over each individual field, but just to show you this whole MS exchange organization, etc. This is all stuff that is specific to Microsoft. So Microsoft Exchange, you wouldn't see this, say, from Google. You wouldn't see this from Yahoo. This is going to be very specific to that email provider. Different email providers will have different things that you can look at, and you want to familiarize yourself with what headers they use, because some of them are going to be a little more chatty, a little more verbose than others. And we'll kind of bring that up here in a moment when I click down. So you'll see if you get further down here, especially towards the top here, you see a couple of things like the SCL, which is 0, and SCL in Microsoft header language means spam confidence level. So the spam confidence level for this was 0 because it did come from a legitimate account, even though we know it's malicious. It's not a bulk spam message, which you see below. The BCL is 0. PCL is the phishing confidence level. So that was 2 because it did seem kind of fishy. But importantly, if you look at the bottom there, that Microsoft anti-spam mailbox delivery, it looks like a ton of nonsense with numbers inside of parentheses. That actually decodes into something important. And Microsoft does have a couple of database knowledge base articles and a lookup tool that you can put these headers into and do some analysis on, and that will tell you like the country code it came from. And other things like that. So there's a lot of richness in here, but again, you want to familiarize yourself with what specific headers exist for specific email providers. All right, moving on from that onto file hashes. File hashes can be used to determine if existing reports for a file are present. So if I have a malicious item, I can take a hash of it and I can look that hash up. And if someone else has already got that file, I may see that they uploaded it 3 months beforehand, which not only gives me another sample, but it tells me that it's been around for at least 3 months. In addition, hashing files is a good way in your records to keep track of different files you've worked with. So, in a situation where you're doing long-term analysis or you're doing analysis for multiple clients, having a hash from one client match a hash from another client 2 months down the road can tell you, there's something similar tying the two of them together. You might have to do a little more research to find out what that means, but at least you have that much evidence there. And also, if you happen to find hashes in a write-up or a white paper or a report of some kind, you can actually use hashes in some cases to obtain samples, and we'll go over that. So really quickly, I happened to be, when I did this example, in my Windows environment, and as you'll see throughout this talk, I like to color my windows depending upon my mood. So I was in a purple mood in this particular day, apparently. And you can actually use Cert Util in Windows to take hashes of files. So I just ran Cert Util on this sodinokibi.bin file, and which is a sample from the Sodinokibi ransomware family. And I put a box around the part there that's the actual hash. All right, so we have this big hash here. It's this BE1E, and it ends in 55B5. What did I say to do earlier? Google stuff. So I Googled it, and I found a Virustotal page for this particular sample. You can see 55 engines detect it, so it's definitely not good stuff. And if we look a little bit further down, we can see the specific detections that each engine labels it as. So in this case, we've got Bitdefender, MZSoft, eScan, Clam, and ESET all say Sodinokibi. So if I didn't already know, because I named the file appropriately, if I didn't already know, then this would tell me, okay, the sample I'm working with here looks like it's probably going to be Sodinokibi. Now, another thing you can do, mentioning the whole thing with hashes, is CrowdStrike has a couple of analysis websites that have APIs. They are free, but they're not open to personal email addresses. So you have to have a company, I'm going to use the air quotes around that, email address to get access to it. I have a $6 email box for my blog, and I signed up for that because it's a unique domain, and I hit up the people from Hybrid Analysis on Twitter, and they DM'd me and said, you're good to go. So it literally took 30 minutes. They responded. I was really impressed with them. So I always like to point that out because they're fantastic, and they got me API access. So with that, there's a couple of things we can do. So this is a page on hybrid analysis for the same sample, which I've highlighted the SHA-256 sum. You can see it's the same thing, BE1E ends in 55B5. If you also look on the right-hand side, you can see that it is showing up there as Sodinokibi as well. And if you look at the top, because I was signed in when I visited this page, there's the option to download the sample. So you can do that. You can just sign in with your account, download the sample, and you're good to go. If you're working with a lot of samples, if you're doing some scripting, that may not be the most efficient way to do it. So to that end, we're going to actually build out a query, take a look at it. So very quickly, just to demonstrate that, I wrote a little PowerShell script that I didn't save. It's just untitled.ps1, but it's just a really quick way in PowerShell to make a request, invoke web request with some headers to, it says reverse it, which is an old name for the hybrid analysis domain. I don't think that's a live website anymore. I think it just redirects you, but it's the same thing. And you can see in the URL, BE1E, same hash. And obviously I blanked out my API key because that's not Halloween candy. It's not free to hand out to everybody. And basically it's going to retrieve the file and save it as Sodinokibi, which I did. And voila, I got a copy of Sodinokibi.bin. So if you were doing analysis and you didn't actually have access to the file anymore, but you wanted to show it off, then you may, and I actually think I just clicked my presentation off with my mouse there. But if you wanted to go through a list of indicators of compromise, for example, this would be a way to do it. Would be to take those hashes from the bottom of the, usually at the bottom of the blog post with all of the IOCs, and you could use those hashes to reach out to sites like this and get additional samples that you didn't have access to in your environment, either because they were deleted by the attackers or maybe your anti-malware software quarantined them or obliterated them somehow. URLs are another big thing. They contain a wealth of information, everything from domains, parameters, directories, files, etc. They can provide a sort of fingerprint for finding other sites with similar URL schemes, and they exist in a variety of malicious instances, everything from phishing emails, click fraud, C2 servers, ransomware portals, etc. all use URLs at some point. Sometimes they use IP addresses. So I picked one. This is actually related to that initial sample I showed with the phishing message I got via text message. This was just one of the domains that was involved in one of the redirects. So I used it here as a sample to kind of break it down. So let's break down this URL. First things first, HTTPS. Doesn't seem like it's important, but that tells us this site has a certificate. And as I will show in another module here in a bit, certificates have a lot of information. So that's one thing already. app-trkrdirect.com, that's a domain. We can pivot off of that. That's another bit of information, which I'll go over our domains here in a bit. We have this file, this CDA, I'm not going to read all of that, .php. All right, so not only does that tell us there's a file here, but we could search for other sites that aren't app-trkrdirect.com and see if they also have that file. And we can't necessarily say they're related, but at least gives us enough evidence to maybe look into them a little bit more. So I used an example here. I couldn't find another copy of that particular file. Even though it's unique, it's not showing up anywhere else. So it is really unique. So I picked a sample I knew would show up. This is not malicious. It's just to demonstrate how it would look in Google. So in this case, I did file type PHP, in URL out.php. And if you look, the part that I have underlined there and at the very bottom where I have the tooltip for highlighting that particular link, you can see it leads to github.com/tenorviol/out.php. So all these sites have out.php in the URL. Now, if you substitute that with what might be a malicious thing, you can see how if Google has indexed a bunch of sites that have the same file, same PHP file, same JavaScript file, etc., you may be able to link a couple of different disparate domains as maybe being related in the same malicious activity campaign. So another thing are parameters. So in this case, a parameter for that PHP file is the CLID equals 137, etc. Again, you could Google that specific ID. That might reveal information. Doubtful, but again, Google everything. Or you can actually look at the parameter itself. Now, in this case, CLID is super generic, and you're going to see that in a lot of different URL schemes that aren't malicious. But for the purposes of demonstration, I did include it. So if we look at in URL, CLID equals right here, this vibrantmedia.co.za. Diligent Corporation, if you look at the tooltip at the bottom, r.php $CLID. So this particular website and file uses a very similar parameter. Again, it's not related in this particular case because it's very common, but it demonstrates how you might be able to use that to find different domains and parameters and files that are all related to one another. So I know I mentioned domains and certificates there, so we're going to pivot off of that directly into domains. They are an extremely rich source of information for pivoting. They have a lot of publicly available information because of DNS records. And if you're reading white papers or write-ups or blog posts, reports, etc., they're going to be a very common indicator of compromise. So on this day, I was feeling in a red mood for my command prompt, apparently. And I used NSLOOKUP to look up another domain related to that SMS phishing attempt that I got. And I just used Google's DNS because I wanted to make sure it didn't get black holed by my DNS filter. And looked it up, and it looks like these two 50.97 IP addresses are tied to clkmg.com. So that's the most basic thing you can do with DNS is just do an NS lookup, see what you come up with. Or you can take that and put it into a tool of some kind. So in this case, this is a Whois record. I'm not going to recommend a specific site because there are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of Whois websites out there, and everyone's got their favorite. But basically, any Whois lookup will do the job for you. In this particular case, I looked it up, and we've got clkmg.com. There's a lot of information you can get off of it, but for this particular slide, I highlighted the creation date. So this domain was created on February 6th of 2014, and I took this like a month ago. So this domain's almost 6 years old. So you know, it's not like someone spun it up for a fly-by-night attack. This has been around a while, which means either they've done a really good job of hiding themselves up until now, or it's probably a legitimate infrastructure of some kind that's being abused. So I did a little bit more information. If you scroll down, we've got the registry information. The organization who registered this domain is ClickMagic. Well, the domain is clkmg.com. The organization is ClickMagic. So those kind of read together as one-to-one. So you know, I didn't show it here, but I could pivot off of ClickMagic into Open Corporates, LinkedIn, Google, anything like that, and look at more on this organization. And I bet you that I would find out that that's a legitimate organization that's just being, its product is being misused for this campaign. In this particular case, the registrar information was GoDaddy.com, which is not particularly useful for a single lookup necessarily. It can be, but in this case, it's just GoDaddy. But you'll see a little bit later that maybe keeping that information on file permanently will help you kind of tie together multiple campaigns if you're doing kind of a long-term research project. So other things we can do with domains. Look up MX records. MX records are basically a way for a domain to say, hey, if you'd like to send email to clickmagic.com or clkmg.com in this case, it's going to end up going to these particular websites, which in this case is Google. So that tells me that that particular domain is using Google Apps for email. That's what they're using for their email provider. We can look up some other things. We can look up SPF, which I mentioned earlier. SPF is fantastic. If we look up the SPF for lowermybills.com, which happens to be, again, related to the same campaign, we see a bunch of stuff in here. We see IP4 for a couple of 100.20s, a 206.130, 72.34. So all of these IP IP addresses or net blocks are all authorized to send email as lowermybills.com. So if we took the time to look into each of those, we could potentially reveal a little bit about the infrastructure behind Lower My Bills. Another one, spfprotectionoutlook.com. Okay, probably means that this particular sender is using Office 365. Another one that's interesting is this _spfact-on.net. I've never heard of that before. That's interesting. It sounds like a legitimate SPF record setup, so I might want to look into what acton.net is. There's some command line tools like Sublister out there where you can put in a domain and it will go and try and pull a bunch of subdomains for that particular domain. So in this case, I went back to clkmg.com and we got a bunch. We got www, which is an obvious one. We've got some really specific ones like 148.762.3831.cokmg.com, which is interesting. CDN, IMAP, Mail, MX, POP3, SMTP. We've got track backend, so that could be interesting. That could reveal some stuff. mtasts.www.cokmg.com, right? We got a ton here. So we could pivot off of each one of those and find out what's hosted on each of those IP addresses. Just another way to kind of highlight where you can go from a single domain. This one I included in here, but you're not going to see a lot of look with it. It's kind of like the Whois records, right? You always want to try it, but whether or not you're going to get anything useful is doubtful. Zone transfers, sometimes you'll get lucky and they will have zone transfers enabled. In this case, they didn't. And I tried a bunch of samples I had, but none of them had it. So I didn't have anything to put in here as an example. But basically, this is similar to Sublister. You're going to be able to see other places where you can get to that domain to another domain that may share similar infrastructure. Same with the Whois records. You know, sometimes you'll look it up and you'll get actual information, which I'll show a little bit later, and a specific case study. Sometimes, especially in 2020 and beyond, privacy registrations are becoming a lot more popular. So most people try to hide stuff. There are ways to get around that, but that's a little outside the scope of this talk. You know, it's always worth the time to look it up, though. Finally, we have hunter.io. Again, I cannot list all the tools that work with domains, so I just kind of picked the ones that I thought were really interesting. Hunter.io basically lets you put in a domain and tries to fetch any email addresses that are associated with that domain. So I went back to lowermybills.com for this, looked it up, and we've got info at lowermybills.com. And then we had a couple that were actually tied to specific people's names. So, you know, who knows what's in here? You know, I had to blank it out, obviously, but those are actual human beings' names. So I could pivot off of that. I could look those people up on social media. I could look them up on LinkedIn. There's all sorts of stuff I could do pivoting to those people's names and maybe find out, is this a legitimate company? You know, how far does the rabbit hole go? If I get that person's name, I could look them up as an officer on other organizations on Open Corporate. Like, there's so many places I could go from here. So Hunter is an absolutely fantastic tool, and I wanted to bring it up while I had domains up. So that's as far as I'm going to go there, because I could do a whole talk on domain analysis alone. So I'm going to cut myself off there because I couldn't go any further. Let's see. We've got analysis IPs. We've got, again, a very common indicator of compromise. If you're looking at domains as an indicator of compromise, the next most common thing aside from file hashes is going to be IP addresses. If you're looking at threat intelligence or reports, you're going to see IPs. Also, domains or resolved IPs at the end of the day. So they can be good use as a verification link or pivot point. And I'm going to put a big old asterisk around that because the way I wrote that in shorthand is to say, hey, if you have other information and you have IP addresses and some more information, it's interesting. But don't assume that because things share a similar IP infrastructure that they're related. There was a really great blog post that came out about that recently in regards to a couple of QAnon things. That basically someone made the assumption that because they shared an IP, they were all related. And as it turns out, there are tons of hosts out there where you have shared IP space. So, you know, Amazon Elastic IPs, you've got, you know, WordPress hosts, stuff like that. So just because you have a similar IP between different websites doesn't mean that they're related. Just want to put that out there because that's a common pitfall for people that are getting started. However, they can be used if you've got more information to tie things together aside from just the IP address itself. And also you can check IP addresses passively for ports and services. You know, you don't want to be doing nmap on things. You don't want to be actively scanning websites when you're doing open source intelligence, but there are ways to get that information regardless. So this is kind of random. I don't think people think to do this a lot, but you can put IP addresses into Virustotal. I have a scripted way of doing this, but you can also just plug it right, you type it in the search bar or put it in the URL where you have the /IP address /relations. I picked one that is also related to this phishing attack. And you can see that 0 out of 83 engines detected as malicious. But what's interesting is that 10 plus files that were detected by at least one engine communicate with that IP address. So I click down. Here you go. Firemin.exe, DVD repair, comment rep, DVD repair.exe again, task host 222222, and a bunch of stuff I'm not going to pronounce. All of those different executables communicate with this IP address in some way, shape, or form, whatever that means. Some of them are detected by 1 engine. Some of them are detected by 60 engines. So that'd be an interesting to pivot off of, is to go look at those samples and see if you can get information off of those, which could lead you down a further, some further clues, some further things to pivot off of. Obviously, we're talking about IPs and you're talking about reconnaissance, you're talking about open source intelligence. You cannot not talk about Shodan. Shodan.io, although I think that domain is changing in the near future because they're building out a new website with some new infrastructure, so it might be going away if I've heard correctly. But it's a great website. I picked an IP address here that was related to the same thing. Yeah, Beta Shodan. Thank you, Ray. I knew they're moving to another thing, so I'm interested to see where that goes. Basically, I plugged this IP address in here, and you can see that it has a ton of ports open on it. So 21, 22, 80. So we've got, FTP, SSH, HTTP, POP, and then all the way at the bottom, you got 3306. We've got database, which is interesting. So that's really questionable. It's also GoDaddy. It might be a shared infrastructure. It might be just one particular website on that shared infrastructure that has an IP that is showing up, but hey. There'd be a little bit further down underneath here that shows specific things about the services, and some of them will show vulnerabilities, but that was kind of outside the scope of this, and I didn't want to keep taking 20 screenshots from this one lookup, but just know that there's a lot you can pivot off of from here as well. And also at the top of the page, you'll try and do some like geolocating of that IP, although obviously geo IP location is questionable at best, so bear in mind. A similar tool to Shodan is Census.io. Same thing. I picked another IP address, dropped it into here. You can see easywordpress.com. It's got HTTPS, SSH, and 80. Nothing really fancy there, but just to show you there's some alternatives to Shodan. And this is the part where I rewind real quick and say, I don't know if they'll do it this year, but I got my Shodan, I think for Black Friday for $1. So just for anyone that doesn't have Shodan, always keep your eyes peeled for Black Friday deals on Shodan. It's like $1 for your life. You're done for the rest of time. So definitely recommend checking the Shodan website on Black Friday. Just saying. Yes, and as Ray I think mentioned in the chat, it's also free for school. So other things you can do, look up connected domains behind an IP address. And this is where my asterisk came from. You have to be careful here. I put in that IP address and said, hey, domain tools, what are some other websites or domains that are associated with this IP? Well, there's a couple of them. Derek-Palmer.com. I don't know Derek Palmer. Derek Palmer could be a great person. I'm not going to make any judgments about Derek Palmer. Maybe I have a great website, but it is on the same IP address as something related to my phishing scam. So could be interesting. Foxlifegood.com. I like foxes. If you have a pet fox, your life could be good. So I'm not going to necessarily judge that domain right away. Could be related, could not be. Then we get rc-connexion.xyz. That's starting to, stray a little bit into the questionable, territory for me. XYZ is not always the most reputable, top level domain. RC Connection, I don't know anything about that. The key here would be to use a little bit of, not just instinct, but just kind of context. So I'll tell you, for example, when you go to the beginning of this talk, when I talked about refund-5.com, that was in the text message. When we looked at that over at Searchlight, there was refund-5.com, refund-4.com, -3.com, -1, etc. So if I did this tool right here, and there's actually a ton of domains here, it just shows me 3 because I wasn't signed in or paying for this. If I see other things that are using that same thing, so refund-number.com, those I can probably at least safely enough assume that I want to pivot off those and look them up. Derek Palmer, though, we're not going to judge Derek Palmer. He's probably got a pretty cool website. Dehashed. I brought up Dehashed because, I think everyone that works in tech at any point in time kind of has that tool that's their current love affair. And for me, recently, Dehashed has been my love affair. I will find any excuse in the world to go to Dehashed and put stuff in there. You can put IPs in there, domains in there, email addresses in there, real names in there, passwords in there. In this case, I picked an IP. I had to hide it because I'm not trying to show stuff here. But if you type in an IP address there, it says, hey, listen, that IP was included in some data that was leaked from collections and some other stuff here. I worked on a case once at work where basically we had someone that was scamming a check cutting system, and we found an IP address, and that IP address was associated with a Gmail account, and I looked up that Gmail account on Spokeo, and I happened to get someone's name, and that name was the significant other of someone that used to work at the company. So yeah, I got from an IP address to a former employee that was gaming the system pretty quickly there. So that was interesting. It is free to do the lookups on dhashed. Actually setting up an account the way I've done it thus far, I don't use it frequently enough that you can buy like a week-long subscription. I think it's like $7, maybe $4, $7, something like that. It's really cheap. So I do that if I have like a lookup that I absolutely need to look at the information there that's in the breach, but can be a good source of pivoting information. And that's what I went over for IP addresses. So now we're going to go to certificates. Certificates, I'm going to touch on lightly because it's hard necessarily to find a good sample for them. But in this particular case, certificates have a little more information, I think, than people will often think is available in them. They're becoming more and more common with things like Let's Encrypt. You're seeing more and more certificates on the internet at any given point in time. And with public key infrastructure, you've got a built-in verification chain via cryptography. So you have got an absolute chain saying, listen, this certificate was signed by this root authority, by this intermediary, etc. You know, built-in pivot for you. There you go. You can walk up the chain and find where things are going. I'm actually going to grab a drink of my coffee before I talk my throat raw real quick. But in this particular case, I return to our favorite, app-trackerdirect.com. In this particular case, we've got a Cloudflare certificate. So nothing illegitimate there, unless you're finding a bunch of websites that are using Cloudflare, and maybe just the fact that they're using Cloudflare is a TTP or modus operandi for them. But in this case, it's just a Cloudflare certificate, but it serves for an example. If we look inside the certificate, we've got the subject. So in this case, sni.cloudflaressl.com. We've got organization information, location, state, country, etc. This is the juicy one, the subject alternative name. So if you look at the top, you see wildcard.app-trackerdirect.com. That tells you that basically they can use this certificate and just re-sign it over and over and over for a bunch of different subdomains. So they could have www.app-trackerdirect.com, mail.app-trackerdirect.com, and all of them could be signed from the same certificate, just with different subject alternative names. Some tools like Sublister, which I mentioned earlier, this is one of the ways that they get that information. They reach out to the certificates that are associated with that domain and they pull the information out of there. When I was doing a sample for this phishing attack, I had one certificate that, I kid you not, had like 80, like 60, 70, 80, like a ton of not even wildcard, just straight domains hard-coded in there. And they weren't even for the same domain. They were all completely different. So that was wild to see all that much hard-coded stuff into one. So someone built that infrastructure and just got really lazy. So you never know what you can find in these things. Thumbprint. Thumbprint's a great one. This is similar to a file hash, right? It's just a cryptographic hash. So hey, we've got this one here, 320F. What can we do with that? Well, obviously we can Google it, like I've said, but in this case, crt.sh, which is a fantastic tool for working with certificates. It is possibly the tool for working with certificates. And I just highlighted the SHA-1 hash there to show you this is the same sample. This is just a small screenshot of this page, but this basically is the certificate transparency log for anything involving this particular certificate chain going back in time. And you can see that the log URL is coming from Google's certificate log services. So I cannot recommend Cert.sh highly enough. It is a fantastic tool. I would use this anytime working with certificates here. So pop stuff in there, see what you can find in there. And that's all I was touching on there. There's a lot more. A lot of times certificates might have a technical contact, like an email address. They may have a department information in there, phone numbers, street addresses. Just depends on what you're working with. Certificates are an interesting thing when it comes to malware, because they can be used on websites for HTTPS, or they can be used to sign executables when they're being built. There was a pretty famous incident, I want to say 4 years ago, where someone at, I think, HP, one of their developers' computers was infected with malware, and he went to build an HP driver, and he signed the malware with an HP driver on accident, and all of a sudden there was this malware floating around out there that had a legitimate signed certificate, so it was getting past a bunch of malware tools. So, even executables have certificates. Take the time to look them up. You never know what you're going to find in them. Moving on to strings. Strings Strings is like the, the secret tool to a lot of things, whether it's HackTheBox or it's doing bug bounty or you're looking at malware. Strings is great. Basically, it's just a tool. There's actually a tool called Strings, but there's other ways to get the strings from files that you can just pull a list of all of the text strings out of a file, whether or not it's an executable, a Word document, a text file, etc. It can be a quick win for finding interesting info in files. I will say, I'm not going to name names, but I've known at least a couple of bug bounty researchers that have gotten fairly sizable bug bounties because they ran strings on a file and they got a hard-coded API key inside of the file, showed up in strings, and within 5 minutes they had that, they submitted it, and they got a bug bounty. Some people accidentally do bad stuff when they're setting up their CTFs, and you can get strings out of things. So, run it. It's like Google. Run it, see what you get out of it. You have no idea how quickly it can shorten your path. Here we go. This is going to be this is like towards the end, but it's one of the longer modules. So in this case, I had an executable called fox.exe. Obviously I was like remoted into a remote session. So it's like 3 degrees of remote that I took the screenshot, which is why it's a little blurry, in my Kali box, and ran it on this fox.exe and popped it to less so I could read it a little more easily. So I'm just going to pick some samples out of here. Right away, P2X DLL, P2X EXE, P2X debug. Those are fairly interesting, so I'm going to Google them. Like I said, Google things. And I saw IndigoStar in there, so here we go. P2X IndigoStar. Takes you right to the IndigoStar website, Perl2EXE user manual. That sounds interesting. Go to the website. Perl2EXE is a command line program for converting Perl scripts into executable files. All right, did a little more research from there in Google. Security Focus by Symantec. Perl2EXE vulnerability. Perl programs compiled, air quotes, into EXEs with Perl2EXE can be decompiled and full unadulterated source code extracted, which sounds good for us, but not good for the people who compiled the files. So that'll come in a little bit, but hey, all it took was running strings. I got some information, and within 4 minutes, I had this information on Google. Fantastic. Let's look a little bit more than that file. Here's some hard-coded information in the form of directories. Usually you see this in a dev environment. At the top, w:/dev/p2x. This is their Perl2EXE dev environment. The W drive is a fairly uncommon drive, so that's unique enough. Sometimes, if you're really lucky, you'll get a username in here because someone doesn't know what they're doing when they go to build a project in like Visual Basic or something like that, or I said Visual Basic, like, anyone's doing anything with that, but Virtual Studio, I was trying to say Visual Studio and I said Visual Basic. That comes in a little bit, not right now. And you'll put their username in there because that's where their project is. Not in this case, but still, always worth a look. So let's Google it. I Googled w:/dev. Hey, look, hybrid analysis, Simru, Joe Sandbox. There are other samples out there that have used this exact same dev environment with the W, or in this case, E, right? Those are things to pivot off of. They may be related, or maybe in that particular year, that was all the rage with attackers. They were all using Perl, to EXE or Python to EXE, whatever the popular craze was at the time. Same thing with the Cs. I went to the C:\Cygwin, found some stuff on Simru, and if you look at it, bam, this sample had these particular, I almost said domains, but directories in them. Very similar to what we already saw. So maybe they're related. Don't know, but it's an interesting thing to pivot to. Here's some more. Look at all these library or API calls. Look at all these Win32 API calls. There's a lot in there. Let's pick one. Let's pick Perl SV2 Mortal. I looked that up, right? rr.exe. There you go. And if you look at the second one, sgen.exe, look at the very bottom, w:/dev, P2X. That could very well be related. So just running strings, picking some unique things out and poking around, you can find some interesting stuff on Google just looking around. That might betray stuff about that file or where it came from, how it was made. Source code. So I'm not going to get into doing static analysis and taking an executable and dumping it and reversing it and actually getting source code. I'm going to cheat a little bit here. And that previous sample that I mentioned, fox.exe, I used that vulnerability to actually get the Perl script out of it. So I got a Perl script out of it, and we're going to look at the source code of that Perl script. Why? Because source code can reveal idiosyncrasies of specific threat actors. This is a very common thing when you look at threat intelligence. You see people saying, well, I have this attack from this threat actor on the automotive industry back in 2018, and I have this attack from a different threat actor against the financial industry in 2020. Interestingly enough, if you get a third of the way through the source code, they have a code block that looks really similar, which means either it's done by the same threat actor, they outsourced to the same person on Fiverr, whatever they did, there's clearly some tie between those two that was not previously known. So just the way people format things, the way they name variables, functions, just the way they beautify their code and lay it out, all those things can reveal a little bit about the attacker. They may, if you're really lucky, contain hard-coded values that can betray sensitive information if someone's really sloppy. Spoiler alert, the people in this attack were very sloppy. So let's look at this. Here's the file I got from there, a.pl. That's a Perl file. Let's run less on it. All right, so here we go. Here's our Perl file. We've got here's a bunch of things being declared. We've got host auth, sleep, IRC name. So we already know we're probably working with an IRC bot of some kind. We've got an IP address for the server. We've got the port. We've got the destroy password, which is an interesting one. And we have the virus password, which is Cox. And this is the part where I say, at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned you should Google everything. Maybe the one exception to that rule in this case is I would not just Google Cox. That may not end well. At best, you're going to get roosters. And that's best case scenario. So maybe think about doing things slightly differently there. I would not just Google that. Not on its own anyway. Maybe with the variable name. But hey, you got the password. So that's interesting, right? The one before that was interesting. Let's go a little bit further. We've got one here about dead in the middle, that die masala fork. I Googled that. Fork, DDoS, GitHub, Perlbot scanner. Those all sound suspiciously similar to what we're looking at, don't they? All right, so I think maybe we're working with a Perl IRC DDoS bot of some kind. Okay. Here's another code section here. If you look at the bottom there, send, draw, join, canal, DDoS it, which canal, I believe, is roughly translated to channel in IRC. Some sort of attack, question mark, says this GitHub gist, and you can see, very similar thing. IRC port, this matches what we're looking at. I'm just picking things here. When I'm looking at this, I'm trying to find things that look like they're unique enough that I can say it's probably the same sample, but not so unique that I'm not going to find any results in Google. There's kind of a fine balance there that you want to hit. Just keep that in mind. And go a bit further. You've got a bunch of strings in here. Thank you for purchasing. Please only use IP to ensure correct booting. There are 5 DDoS functions. So this basically confirms we're working with a DDoS bot. Go a little bit further. Get a little bit of stuff here. We've got, first of all, I want to point out to this goodbye, cruel, cruel world. Always makes me laugh. The function is die bitch. So, we could Google that. We've got a bunch of stuff here. Sender, recipient, corp, mail type. The sample was from a couple years ago, but I believe roughly this turns down into you're DDoSing someone and then send them a message saying, hey, I'm DDoSing you, give me money so that, I can stop DDoSing you. This is basically what you're looking at here. And then, oh boy, we hit the jackpot. Look at all those IP addresses. And I'm telling you, when I look at the screenshot, this is only like a fourth of the IP addresses that were hard-coded in this Perl script. There were I kept scrolling, and they're just IP address, IP address, IP address. And this is where we bring up the importance of maybe scripting, because we don't want to Google. I mean, we want to Google, but maybe not manually type in all those IP addresses and do lookups, but that's information we can pivot off of. It's a lot of information. And of course, I like to include Twin Peaks references in basically everything I do. So I have Mr. Jackpots here from the new season of Twin Peaks. But looking a little bit further into it, we've got some more stuff here, right? Look at these. This is a perfect example, right? Some of these things are a little common, right? So H2C NNB16. That is unique enough that I'm probably going to Google it and see what it turns up. So I did. What did we get here when we Googled that top one up there, that NN, NH, etc.? MikroTik router board, denial of service on ExploitDB. Interesting. Let's read it. I got a CVE from that ExploitDB page. I looked up that CVE. MikroTik router board is prone to a remote denial of service vulnerability. All right, we know we're working with the DDoS IRC Perl bot. We know this is a particular exploit, so it's probably got some exploits. It's looking for particular candidates that's looking at, and this tells us a little bit about the file just by Googling stuff, right? We could step through here and try and reproduce all the logic, We could sit here and try and say, okay, so that variable passes this variable to that function, or we could just Google things, right? You know, obviously we want to verify our information, but that's the point of this talk really is I learned a lot about this file. I didn't have to run anything. I just pulled strings off of it and Googled them, and I've learned a lot about this file just by doing that. So save yourself some time and at least give yourself context to the work you're going to do, you know, rather than just diving in and getting your hands dirty right away. And I put this last page in here because, wow, you know, I'm not going to say that adults can't use this, but I've got a strong feeling that if I had to pick the demographic of people that are utilizing this booter, it is probably not working professionals. If I had to take a stab in the dark here, just saying. Also, I don't think they like Brian Krebs. All right, metadata. This is the part where I get to bring up my love of true crime real quick. So metadata is great. I think everybody wants to say something about metadata. You know, I think we all think of OSINT. When we think of files, the first thing people think of is, did they keep GPS coordinates inside of their file? Are they going to get caught like McAfee did back in the day by accidentally keeping GPS coordinates inside of a picture? You know, that's not the only way to use metadata. That's one way, but there's other stuff, right? So it's often overlooked by anyone that's an amateur. Sometimes even professionals will overlook metadata when they're building files. And metadata is in more than just pictures. It can be in pictures, audio files, video files. It can be inside of Word documents, right? So if we look a little bit further down and we look at a huge variety of information available depending upon the source artifact, you know, you'll understand that each type of file has different types of information you can get out of it, right? So in this case, I picked a doc file because I'm working with malware. I had somebody send one of those run-of-the-mill things like, hey, please click enable macros and you can go to Dropbox and download your bonus for the month. You know, obviously when you enable macros, it's just going to run a Visual Basic script. This is where I meant to say that earlier. This is where you're going to get it and you're going to get infected. It's still a Word document at the end of the day. We can look at metadata on a Word document. And I mentioned true crime because I grew up in Kansas before I moved to New York. We had a famous serial killer there, went by the moniker BTK. He went uncaught for like 2 decades, right? Liked to taunt the police. And at one point basically sent wrote to the police in the newspaper, was like, if I send you some information, can you get information off of a file? Or can I, you know, email you my taunts? And they're like, yeah, sure, email us your taunts, whatever. Sent them a floppy disk with, you know, a Word document in it. Didn't realize he did that from his church computer where he was like a president of a board there, and it was registered to the church. So the police department, this guy's been caught for 20 years, take this floppy disk, look at the Word document, they get the name of the suspect's church, and they found him pretty quickly after that. So, you know, metadata can trip people up. It can trip up people who haven't been caught for 20 years, so you never know. In this particular case, no such luck. This one, I've got the file name. You know, this I just ran XFTool because XFTool is probably the tool to go to when it comes to working with metadata when it comes to super basic things. It's available on all operating systems. I use it all the time. I also use it to strip metadata from files before I post them. You know, that's a little bit of OPSEC advice for you. Nothing on the file name, nothing on the author, nothing on the last modified by, even though the author looks unique, this IHP, SP, JJ, DQDF, you know, I didn't get anything when Googling those. Look at the code page though. The code page is Windows Cyrillic. All right, so maybe we understand a little bit about where this came from. Could be a false flag. Someone could be trying to pin the attack on Eastern Europe. We don't know. I did Google the file name though. This is funny. So I wanted to point this out because it made me laugh. I Googled the file name, and there were only 2 results in Google, and they were both from my blog back in 2015. I Googled this like 2 weeks ago. So apparently, in the preceding 5 years, no one else has. I actually triggered Google when I said that. Go figure. No one else has apparently seen this. So that was funny to me. But you never know. Sometimes you'll get something interesting. This could have been somebody else's blog, and then why waste my time when I could look off their information? Luckily, I got another sample later that day. Same thing. Please enable macros. Look it up. Author, GIWDJ. I could look it up, but that's not a very long or complicated string. Last modified by owner. Definitely not unique. Not going to just Google that. Then we hit something here. Company, specialist repack. So we're going to look that up, right? If you also look down a little bit further, you can see the heading pairs. You can see, I don't know what that noise was. I think my washing machine may be going crazy. Heading pairs, you can see a little bit of Cyrillic there. And the code page is Windows Cyrillic. And hyperlinks, Office 365. So we're going to look up Specialist Repack. Specialist Repack is a Russian digital publisher that is used for repackaging software. According to MZSoft malware database. Done, right? All right, cool. Russian publisher, right? We've got Windows Cyrillic code pages. We've got some Cyrillic headers and MZSoft malware. So probably not good news. Again, doesn't mean they're a bad company, but someone is clearly abusing their tool to make bad stuff. And here we come to family-specific considerations. Yes, thank you. EXIF data can be manipulated. And I think, just as a kind of example of that, I mean, I keep that in mind with anything, right? So like something, almost anytime you're working, make sure you're verifying and you're cross-verifying when you're working with Intel, because any individual data point could be manipulated, could be a false flag. You know, don't trust it on itself. Try to cross-verify with other data sources. But yeah, with EXIF data, not only can it be scrubbed out of a file. So again, when I go to post things, I like to remove metadata out of it so I don't give away anything sensitive. In addition, people can put false metadata in files. So thank you for pointing that out, Ray. We come to the point here where I'm going to kind of bring up a couple of family-specific considerations just as a kind of case study thing. So the three things I've worked with probably the most commonly, or the things that I've kind of had a passion for, I guess I would say, would be ransomware, crypto miners, and fake tech support pages. So I kind of want to touch some things to show you what we might get out of those. So ransomware. All right, what do we got? Ransom notes. Ransom notes are going to have things like Tor sites, email addresses, cryptocurrency addresses. They also have language in there that's written in them. So again, we can see if there's any idiosyncrasies in the way things are written. Got a couple of examples here. In this case, this was someone had just found an open port on a NAS storage device on somebody's home network. Went in, deleted the files, put this text file at the root of the drive and said, hey, I deleted your stuff and I'm going to leak it. Give me money to this Bitcoin address. $100, which is like the cheapest thing. I was like, oh, that's really fantastic. $100. Turns out they didn't actually encrypt the files. They just deleted them and they were in the recycle bin. So I just restored them. So that's funny. That got me here. Which again, interesting. You know, I make a joke about that, but that's a TTP. That's modus operandi. That's a particular thing this threat actor did. They didn't actually encrypt the files. They just deleted them. So if I see that same thing on other things, maybe it's the same people doing it. In this case, we've got Bitcoin address and at the bottom, PTSD, which is supposedly like the signature of the threat actors. But obviously, if I just Google PTSD, I'm probably not going to find anything interesting on that on its own. That's not individually. I'm probably not going to get anything from that Google. But let's work with this cryptocurrency address, right? And this is the point where I say probably like a week before a week after I finished this talk, I found a bunch of resources thanks to, I think Ray actually turned me on to them. Bellingcat.com has a bunch of excellent articles written on tracking cryptocurrency, things you can do to pivot off of it. So I picked a couple of things here and threw them in after the fact. Unfortunately, this particular address, no one ever paid money to, so we're not going to get a lot of good information off of it, but at least I can bring up the websites and show what you might see. So in this case, I have been using blockchain.com since forever. So that I knew about prior to that article. This is basically, hey, listen, how much is this address received, sent, how much is in it? If you scroll down further, see the different transactions. You can look at different things in there. You can look at dates, times, to, from, addresses, etc. Again, here, this case, nobody ever transferred money, which means either this was not a very convincing attack or they used a different wallet for different victims. There's also Bitcoin Who's Who. This can tell you things like how it's related to other stuff. So we've got Bitcoin address report, right? We've got the BTC address, obviously. There's no balance here, no transactions, so nothing to look at here, but this can give you an idea of, hey, you know, we've seen that same address in a bunch of different things, and also, look, there's a scam alert on this particular address. This is another great tool you can use to try and find out a little bit more about that information without having to manually build those transaction logs and kind of, you know, build your little what's the meme, the Pepe Silva mailroom thing. You're not going to take a bunch of strings and try and put stuff together yourself. You know, use this tool to jumpstart your Bitcoin analysis. Here's another sample. This one is my claim to fame. It's what I'm going to go down in history for, I think. No, this was Crypto Wall 4.0. I think I was the first person to report this on Bleeping Computer back in the day, and this is what the ransom note looked like. Has a bunch of payment portals. So Pay Partners To Do, Aleppo, Barclay Partners, Maverick, paypartners.com. There's an Onion address there for Tor. I had to blank out the ID because, I don't know if that's available anywhere else that would, end up revealing the victim. But there's a bunch of stuff you can pivot off of, right? So not only the verbiage of the information itself, this is technically this is like an HTML file. You could look inside the HTML, do some pivoting off these domains. We also have this one, which I believe was Dharma was the family that put this particular ransom note down. And the image will make sense in a second. So what do we got here? We have an email address, leebob78@aol.com. We have the ID, which I blanked out. We've got a Jabber address. We've got a Proton Mail address. Okay, any one of those things we could look up. We could also look up the text on this page. Also, this particular family likes to embed the primary email address inside of the file name. So employee payroll.xl became employee payroll.leebob78@aol.com.roger, which that's why there's a Jolly Roger there. That's the joke. So, Also, the file extension .roger. Bet you 9 times out of 10, if you have a unique file extension for a ransomware attack, you're going to find a thread for it on bleepingcomputer.com. There will probably be a forum post or an article by Lawrence Abrams about that particular thing. So if you looked up Roger Crypto Ransomware, you're probably going to find a reference to it because that is one of the best places to get information on ransomware. Crypto miners, pretty basic. They use the resources of a computer that does not belong to them to mine cryptocurrency. There you go. Things like they may contain things like pool information, credentials, wallet details, etc. Otherwise, treat them like you would a normal file and attack them like you usually would. I'm going to say here, this particular sample I'm really upset about because I was going to write a blog post about it back in the day. I never ended up doing it. And I have a pretty sizable vault of malicious samples that I've kept over the years. And out of all the ones I've kept, somehow I never got this one in there. I spent like 5 hours trying to find the sample so I could take screenshots, go over things, explain how I basically got from the executable file to I think I found the person's social media post. Couldn't find the file. Was livid. Literally looked everywhere I could. And then randomly at like 2:17 in the morning, because this is how my brain works, I remembered something and I Googled it. Wolf XMR miner. That's what I ended up looking up. And lo and behold, I found a GitHub page. So I didn't have the sample, but I was able to retrace my steps. Here we go. There was a file on a client's domain controller server, was balking up their CPU, did some string analysis on it, and saw Wolf XMR miner was listed inside of the executable as a string. Okay, found this page here. If you go a little bit further towards the bottom, there's donations accepted here at this particular address. What do we do with this? We Google it. Where do we end up? This random forum page. Okay, here we go. Here's 3 addresses. The one boxed in red, that matches the one we just saw on the page before. The part boxed in blue may be a coincidence, but says Wolf, and this is Wolf's XMR miner. If that's a coincidence, that's the best coincidence I've ever seen. The one above it also says slut, and the one on the bottom has like pay in it. I don't know if those are probably just coincidences, but the one saying Wolf, I have a feeling they rolled until they got that one. And then if you look on the right where it has it boxed in yellow, we see Wolf 0. Okay, so pretty sure we're still dealing with the same person here. Go a little bit further down that page. We see Wolf 0, and we see a GitHub page, Wolf9466, which does not match the GitHub page I showed in my previous slide. Okay, so let's go there. Wolf9466. All right, 2 followers, nothing particular. Let's look at the date they joined GitHub. September 8th. Okay, let's Google that username. Okay, they have a Twitter account. They joined in September. Okay, let's keep looking. They joined Reddit, and they joined in September. All right, so I brought this up for 2 reasons. One, because this sample is from like 2015, and all of these accounts showed up last year. So that's interesting. I have a suspicion. I haven't looked into it. I might revive this and look into it. I have a suspicion probably things lapsed and someone went through and just claimed all of these names. And I'm guessing it's the same person because it's September 8th, September 11th. I'm pretty sure they just grabbed all these usernames they could within the same 3 days. I got all that from executable. I went from executable to a name of a tool to a GitHub page to a forum post to another GitHub page, and here we are. Right, so just pivot. You have no idea. We went from that, and I didn't go any further in this particular slide, but I eventually found a social media page that had fairly strong indication that it was the same person that built that miner. Fake tech support, which is our last thing here. Fairly prevalent depending upon when and where you are on the internet. Can contain a variety of intel types, and it's often poorly protected because of the cheap nature by which these domains are kind of spun up. You know, these domains might live for an hour and then they die. So no one's going to invest time into making them robust. They just want to get them up, do their thing. Hopefully they get a couple of victims before it's taken down. What am I talking about? Well, these are some of the things you'd see, right? You go to a web page, you get a redirect from an ad, or the domain, you know, has expired and someone took over the domain or redirects you. You end up on this fake blue screen. Driver unloaded without canceling pending operations. Blue screen error. Please contact computer technicians at this phone number. Here's a pop-up. You know, you've got a domain here. virus-breach-check.com/message. And it's hard to tell because it's so small, but it doesn't say DLL, like the file extension. It says DILL, like a pickle, like dill pickle. So, and just, you know, homoglyph. They were trying to make it look like DLL, I guess. And that's interesting because I found a couple of different campaigns that use that .dill. So that might be related. Obviously, we've got a bunch of stuff we can pivot off of, like the language, you know, we've got the phone number, etc. This is another example, fairly similar. Different domain, still has .dill, but it's a different phone number this time. Here's another example. Looks different this time. Doesn't have .dill. This one says Windows 7, which was the predominant operating system in place at the time, and was doing some detection. And I think I covered it up, but it says your IP. And behind there, it actually had the IP and the ISP of the provider. So, you know, really from a social engineering perspective, you know, anyone that's not computer savvy sees this and they see their operating system and their provider, they're going to get convinced, right? So there's a bunch of interesting stuff here we could look up. This was a pet project of mine for like a year. I was collecting these as I ran into them at work and basically dropping them to an Excel file. And I only cut off at 21 rows, but I'm pretty sure I had somewhere on the order of 250 different domains. And I was splitting them up by the second level domain, the first level domain, IP, host, registrar, anything like that, right? And you can see some of them, you don't get a whole lot. Some of them you can see in DigitalOcean. You've got lumen65.site. Nothing interesting there. It's enum, no registrant. Some of them, you'll look at PC Care Help Online, which is Cyrus1 is the host, .com, registrar PDR, and then you look, and I had to blank it out, but I had first and last names and just Gmail addresses and phone numbers. Now, that may have been the attacker being sloppy, and they just didn't care. That may have been someone's account was breached, and they used their account to basically set this up, or someone was spinning up a bunch of fake accounts, sock puppet accounts, and using those to make these domains. Either way, you know, this was extremely prevalent, and you see everything from specific things like PC Care Help, promoted assistance, system error, and then some gibberish like Y604089, right? My goal here was to basically say, I'm going to get all this information and I'm going to find out if it's the same 1, 2, or 3 companies that's behind everything. I want to blow the door open. Incidentally, Microsoft did a couple of years later kind of blow the door open on some of these scammers, and they were all, a lot of them connected. But that's kind of what I was going for here across a large period of time, trying to trace this all back to similar people. You can look inside the HTML of these things. Look at this. This is fairly cleanly written as far as the formatting. This Windows location, localhost :8080 Dropbox scan site. We've got the phrasing. We've got these functions here, which basically make it so that if you try to touch a key or delete, it pops up a message saying, your IP has been registered, which is not spelled right. It says registered. I would Google that. I would Google your IP has been registered and see what I find, right? Because that's a misspelling. That's going to be really unique. While you were trying to copy code, I'm just a bad hacker over here. I'm trying to copy the code from this website. Shame on me. And there you go. It locks up the browser until you close it or whatever. There's also MP3 files, MP4 files on some of these websites. When you go to it, it plays the same repetitive, scary sounding message that says, hey, your computer's been hacked. You need to go ahead and pay us to remote on and remove viruses and fix your hard drive. Please do. And I actually have those here. I'm going to mute myself. I'm going to play through these samples real quick. I'm assuming that's cutting out for everybody else as well. It's getting like 2 verbs in and it quits. We're going to try the third one and see if we get lucky. Yeah, it's like starting right away and then it cuts off. It's really not consequential to talk. It was more for funny factor. So Yeah, I got an important security message and it cut off. So I don't know why it's not going through. That's unfortunate. But basically, really basically robotic saying warning, security message. You can't hear, you can't close this web page. Don't shut down your computer. Imminent hard drive damage. Your firewall's infected. Basic nonsense, right? All in a robotic voice. It's not a human recording, but you listen to the file. Listen to what it says, right? That verbiage could be the same on different websites. The file name, the tone of the voice. Maybe randomly you get someone that actually does record their voice instead of using one of these text-to-speech tools. That having been said, we can also look at these tools themselves, look at the files themselves. I downloaded them from the website. So we've got one of them, date modified. It's not really consequential, but if the website was registered yesterday and the date modified was 4 months ago from that file, then that file has probably been in use on various malicious websites or was stolen somewhere, if it sounds super legit, for the past 4 months. That could be a data point. This one's really interesting. One of them had comments in the MP3 file, right? 2014, 0515 at a time. There's a host. I would definitely Google that host for sure. Kilobits per second, kilohertz. So I copied this and I pasted it into Notepad++. I had to cut it off because this was a massive page here. This is everything that was in that comment on that MP3 file. Same thing, the duration, the date, the host, kilobits, kilohertz, lip string, and then at the bottom you see phonemes. Now, if you are not someone that is kind of a retired anime fan, such as myself, phonemes, you'll be familiar with in things like Vocaloid, but basically it just means like the way something is pronounced, right? So X, like the letter X, if you want a text-to-speech engine to say it, you might type it ECKS. So it actually says X. You may not like the way it says it that way, so you do EXX. That sounds like a different way of saying X. This is basically the phonemes that make it spell out warning, important security announcement, etc. Interesting that all this is embedded in here, and we may be able to find some stuff that tells us the type of text-to-speech software that made this file. Combine that with the date, domain, there you go. You've got a couple of data points to pivot off of. So even something as simple as this MP3 file that was looping in the background has some intelligence in it that's worth looking into. And that is all I have as far as individual families and different things to look at. There are a ton more places I could have gone. I'm a little upset again to play those samples. It's like one of my favorite parts, but for some reason I changed the way it was embedded in the slides instead of playing them independently by launching VLC because I thought it would save me time. And it worked when I recorded it, but it didn't work now. So yeah, it wasn't really anything exciting, but I'm just upset about it. Anyway, the conclusion is don't look at anything without considering that it might be a potentially useful piece of intel, right? MP3 file, phonemes, things like that. You never know when that's going to get combined with the registration information. Combine that with the person's Gmail, which was in a breach on dhash, which had an IP address, which you look up that happens to have a port open that lists something. Like the things you pivot off from various things. You never know when the next thing that you pivot off of is going to have that piece of intelligence that just ties everything together. Obviously, context is king here, or context is queen. If you want to look at anything like this, it depends on your role, right? If you're a static analyst, you're probably not trying to prove out certain things. If you're someone that's doing threat intel, you might be. If you're trying to piece together ATPs over a 3-year span and you're trying to collect all the information you have, then yeah, you want to document stuff, right? You want to have all this information because you never know when, an example I give is someone has a malicious file and they have it in May. They make a new file, version 2 in June. They make a new version, version 3 in August. Then the next year rolls around. They make version 4, 5, 6, and all of those, no information on them. Version 7, the person making the file misclicks. They don't encrypt the file. They give away information, right? So you never know when the next pivot, the next time you try something, the next time you look something up on Virustotal because you got the encrypted file on your system, but a threat intel report on a random blog has the unencrypted version from 2 months ago, that could be the thing that blows the door open for you. But that having been said, have a plan. Know what you're looking for when you're going into it, right? You have to have a goal. The goal isn't to just, I'm going to Google all the things and see what I get, because I'll tell you, when I started doing that SMS phishing thing at the beginning, I posted that and had some friends involved with the intention of, hey, everybody, let's figure this out overnight. By tomorrow morning, we'll have a little bit about this. I'm still working on it. There's like 40 domains involved, and IP addresses and email addresses and companies and files, and you never know how things are going to just blow up on you. So you kind of have to know what you're going into before you just try and get all of the intelligence, right? You have to steer what you're doing. Ask questions, and then you gather evidence to support those questions. And also document things. As we saw with my wolf example, make sure you're documenting things. You never know when you're going to lose track of a file. And even if I wanted to now, I probably wouldn't write a blog post about that original file because I just don't have the original file to back it up. It would just look like I was fabricating things. So you got to make sure you're documenting stuff as you do your analysis. Further learning, things you can do to pivot from here. Now, I'm not trying to build a course here to tell you here's what you should do. I'm telling you the things that I have done. The things that I know I have done to get to the level of knowledge I have here. I started out with open security training, which is a channel and a couple of different playlists for dynamic analysis, static analysis, and so on and so forth on YouTube. Dated videos, the samples are old, the quality is not the best, but I have a soft spot in my heart, and they teach you a little bit on, especially a dynamic analysis course, on how you can go from a sample to running it to see how it affects the system, right? OA Labs, probably the best static analysis channel that there is on YouTube. Still making videos to this day, high quality, super explanatory. The people who run it are fantastic, wonderful channel. Malware Analysis for Hedgehogs, run by Karsten. Karsten is also a phenomenal human being. Single person running things, not as frequently updated, but when there are updates, it's great. Another channel ran by an individual person is Hasharazad on YouTube. She has a channel where she goes over different samples for static analysis, and she's actually written a ton of tools that you probably will see in almost any write-up, like PE Bear and PE Sieve. She wrote those tools, so she demonstrates them a lot. She's a brilliant individual. All those channels I've watched for malware analysis, and it's taken me a long way. For open source intelligence, Sourcing.Games is great. Sourcing.Games covers everything. It may cover metadata in a document. It may cover looking people up on LinkedIn. It may cover, reversing an email address. There's all sorts of stuff that Sourcing.Games will do. There's tons of games and levels there. Try HackMe, same thing. A lot of users submitted rooms for a variety of things, from network analysis to open source intelligence. I happen to love, I was recommended by a friend in open source intelligence. Robert Folker has a couple of intelligence and analyst courses on Udemy. See what you want about Udemy. Catch those things when they're on one of Udemy's mini sales. I think I got all 3 courses for $30 altogether. Basically, Robert Folker was a head of the Weapons Academy, taught intelligence for the U.S. Air Force, and those courses, while they're not like strictly telling you like which websites to use, they cover like how to be an analyst, the mindset you should be on, the techniques you should use to cut out bias. Phenomenal. Cannot recommend that course enough. Verification Handbook in any of its many versions. It actually right now came out after I made these slides, but the Knight Center for Journalism in Austin, Texas is doing an online course that has a bunch of people that were involved in the Verification Handbook, is doing an online journalism course currently in week 2, and it's free. Fantastic stuff. And I am currently reading the book Open Source Intelligence Methods and Tools, A Practical Guide to Online Intelligence, which I'm about halfway through now. Very thick, just very like specific tools. Obviously, some of them are dated because that's what happens in open source intelligence. Things get dated quickly, but the concepts and the ideas still reign supreme. Again, I point that out because I'm reading that book. That's probably the first open source intelligence book that I've read. I know everyone else is going to tell you to go read Intel Techniques, Michael Basil's book. I still need to get around to that. I have a copy of it, and I'm ashamed to say I haven't read it yet. But this is a good book, too. And I like giving credit where credit's due because I've been reading it, and it's been fantastic thus far. That's it. So I put some follow me's up here. I already put this on the beginning slide. Espen says that Folker's course is on sale right now for $10.99. That's how much I got it for. Yeah, I got all 3 courses for $30 altogether. Very good stuff. Phenomenal. I put some links up here for PresComm and my various places you can find me. At the PresComm on Twitter, my blog, presumptuouscommoner.com. And I put a Discord link up here. This is where I hang out most of the time, doing a lot of this type of work, like that SMS phishing thing I pointed out. I don't know how many people here are heavily involved in Discord, but it is that is the Searchlight Discord server, and it is a phenomenal community, and I'm doing all sorts of work like this on there on a regular basis. So those are the top places you can find me. And this is where I click over to the thank you and question slide. And I don't know. I literally went for like an hour and 20 minutes. So oops. But hey, if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I have a question.
Oh, okay.
So I do open source intelligence a lot. So this was a very interesting take on open source intelligence because I don't know anything about malware or anything like that. So thank you for that. You said have a plan. So I was wondering if you go into it using a certain methodology or if you do kind of what I do and just click on stuff until you find something.
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of it's kind of guided by what I'm doing at work at the time. So if I have, prime example, if I have a crypto ransomware incident at a client, the client's down, like they can't do anything. Their whole network's taken out. And a lot of people's first instinct is let's go ahead and delete all of the files, let's shut things down, unplug things, and then we're good to go. Like that's bad. A, you're stomping on evidence, and B, it means that, if you clean up the malware, but you don't find out how they got in, 2 weeks later, after you've recovered everything, they're going to come back in and do the same thing. So like for me, the first thing I do is say, what intelligence do I need to gather to determine how they got in and how to shut this down? Now, sometimes I get that stuff, obviously, like I look at their firewall and I see, oh, crap, they have RDP open in the public internet. That's probably how they got in. Sometimes it's not that obvious. So what I do is I find the malware family, like Sodinokibi, and then I'll find articles on Sodinokibi and find out, okay, I have an article from 2 weeks ago from, the FBI, from IC3, from Cert, from a local Cert here in New York. And it'll say, hey, listen, the common way they get in are these 3 ways. And then instead of me having to do all this work to find it, I've got a recent threat intel report telling me how they get in. And I use that to kind of guide where I'm going. Rather than just trying to Google all the things, I Google just enough to try and find that report that I'm looking for, and then go from there.
Awesome. Does anybody else have any questions? Espen has one.
It looks like, do you have any tips on note-taking? What is your workflow like as you explore the different paths, and how do you make sure you can always take a step back or two? So this is one of those things where it, again, depends on what I'm doing. So a lot of times when I'm working, I may not have the luxury where I'm at of having an analysis environment with me. A lot of times when I do this, it's feet on the ground. I'm on a train headed into New York City to go into a building where I may not have access to anything other than the environment itself. I can't analyze tools, so I've got to work with what I got in front of me. Screenshots, I just basically everything. If I find a file and I see a directory structure, I screenshot the directory structure. If I take a hash, I screenshot the hash. And if I go to a website, I take a PDF of the website or I export the website. Basically, I don't let myself go 4 steps before documenting. I take a step and I document it, and I take a step and I document it, and I don't let myself. It's really tempting to just turn loose and do all the things and try and document later. I always advise against that. Like, it's hard, especially in malware. You're going to be working with people, especially if it's a client or your environment. People are going to be breathing down your neck wanting things fixed, and you have to kind of avoid the temptation when you're working with forensics to rush things, because either you lose evidence or you cause more damage. Note taking, I mean, I'm not fancy, right? Like I will screenshot things with either the operating system or my work issued phone, and I will put things into like OneNote or Notepad or Word. Like I don't have a special tool for documenting malware analysis. I use whatever's available, and then later on I will prettify things in Word. But the first thing first is just getting all that information to a directory. And I think I see another one here. Know any good alternatives to malware domain lists that are current? I'm trying to think if I know any off the top of my head that I can. I don't work with this stuff as frequently anymore, so it's hard for me to say I know of anyone that are good. I feel like I know one off the tip of my head, and I'm gonna see maybe I can get it real quick. There used to be one called like, I'm thinking more of like samples. I'm thinking like Malware Zoo. Yeah, Zoo. Thank you. That's exactly what I was going to say. It was the Zoo. There's one like that. That one's a fantastic one. I have one. I want to say I know the name of it, but I'm not going to say it out loud until I've made for sure. I'm so mad. I feel like the place, I think it's maybe VX Underground has a lot of samples. I don't know if they have a domain list, but VX Underground has samples for stuff like that. Anything like, like OpenDNS, Umbrella, they're like a DNS filtering, so they'll do a lot of like botnet domains and stuff like that. Spam, Web Titan does a similar thing. I think Cisco, any of the big ones, any of those are going to have domain lists that they themselves block, but those may be everything from adware to, phishing. So depends on what you're looking for.
Great. Any more questions? If not, we can wrap it up for the night. Going once. Cool. Sounds like we're all done. Well, this was great, James. Thank you. I got a lot out of it. I hope everybody else did too. It will be up on YouTube, so you can watch it again. All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. And have a good night.
Yep. And thanks for having me. Have a good night, everybody.